You're listening to Fast Facts, Ask the Expert with Tom Viola. Our listeners, welcome to the Fast Facts, Ask the Expert with Tom Viola. Tom, thanks for being here today.
Andrew, thank you so much. You know, it's always a pleasure being with you, buddy. I appreciate it. Thank you.
No, I'm really excited for the series for this year. So listeners, last year, if you didn't get a chance to listen to Tom's episodes, we talked a lot about local anesthesia. We are going to pivot this year and we're going to talk about, we're still going to stay within drugs, but we're going to be talking more about like the maybe illegal drugs, or maybe some of those drugs that you are watching an episode of your favorite crime show and they're talking about this drug. And you're like, you know what? I don't really know what that is. And so I'm really excited for this one because it's just interesting, unique, and I don't think it's being done anywhere else. So hopefully you're excited for this too.
Very much so, bud. Very much. Let's do this.
All right, so here we go. I think the first drug I want to talk about, I was listening to a podcast and they were talking a lot about fentanyl and how it is actually able to be procured in prisons, and there's such an epidemic in prisons. And then you look at, nationwide, we're having some issues with it. So could you break down fentanyl for us? What do we know it by any other name? What is it doing to our body? If our patients are on it, what are their manifestations?
Right. So fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. Unlike a lot of opioids that we are well familiar with, codeine, morphine, that kind of thing. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. So you don't need poppies to make fentanyl. You do need poppies to make morphine and to make heroin, but you don't need poppies to make fentanyl because it's completely synthetic. Okay, so what other name would you know it by? It might be carfentanil, which is the veterinary product that's also used like fentanyl. It was used forever in patches that people use for chronic pain. But fentanyl in and of itself now has become its own drug because it's a step up from heroin. Heroin ends up becoming not so popular anymore with the cartels and others, because while they still make it, the end product has to be made directly from poppy. So you got to grow the poppy, then you got to transport it somewhere else to make morphine, then you got to transport that somewhere else to make heroin. And the product you end up with is a brick, basically, that's heavy, hard to conceal, takes up a lot of space, not good. In a plastic bag, I can carry enough fentanyl, a little plastic bag like a sandwich bag, I can carry enough fentanyl to kill a whole city. So it's microgram doses of fentanyl, and it finds its way in so many other different products because I can put fentanyl in almost anything. One of the biggest concerns with fentanyl right now is the fact that it's being mixed with xylazine, which is a veterinary tranquilizer. That veterinary tranquilizer lasts about 10 hours. The fentanyl lasts about 6. So if you are given a sample of fentanyl that contains xylazine, well, for 10 hours, you're in this sort of comatose state. But when you come out of it after 10 hours, you've been in withdrawal from the fentanyl for 4 hours because it wore off in 6. And so now you're desperate for a dose of fentanyl, which I'll be happy to sell you with more xylazine in it. But fentanyl is just one of the many illicit opioids that are out there that have made their way into the drug supply. A lot of these things like tianeptine and nitazines, phenibut, these are opioids or opioid-like substances that were created by manufacturers in Europe in the 60s and 70s that were shelved because we ain't going to sell that stuff. That's way too addictive. Only to make that now, that resurgence, and find their way back into the drug supply now. So synthetic opioids are where they're at because they're easy to make. They don't require, anything beyond, chemicals that are easily obtainable. And it's funny because people don't know where they're actually made. A lot of people assume most of the stuff is made in Central America, South America, Mexico. But quite frankly, a lot of it's also made in Canada. The U.S.-Canada border is a lot longer than the U.S.-Mexico border. And it's got 5 inland oceans, the Great Lakes, which are easily traversed by boats without much oversight. The Coast Guard does what it can, but it's basically like an ocean. So anybody can sneak it across the border, Michigan, Wisconsin. And that's why I think ultimately fentanyl is what it is. Now, how do you know your patient's using fentanyl? Well, it's pretty obvious from their look in their eyes, okay, that their eyes may seem droopy, their pupils may be somewhat pinpoint, and at the same time, their breathing is labored. But I think it's a lack of attention, a lack of acuity that would be the most obvious sign for someone who's using fentanyl, along with the fact that if they're using fentanyl, they may not want to use an opioid that your dentist prescribes, but then again, maybe they are. Maybe they're, they're mixing up fentanyl with prescription opioids. But you've always got to be on the alert for, certain behaviors that are indicative of someone who's shopping you for drugs like, codeine and hydrocodone and oxycodone.
And I know this is probably a little bit basic, and I'm so unfamiliar with drugs. I feel so ridiculous about this, but So this is a microdosing situation, and so you're mixing in with something else. So it can be in pill form, it can be injectable, it can be all sorts of different ways that it's administered.
Typically powder, mixed with other powder drugs because they're easiest to consume, but it's not uncommon to find some innocuous items like cigarettes and so on that have been laced with fentanyl or dipped in fentanyl liquid and so on. So it's kind of hard to observe where fentanyl is in the supply because it could be even included in some of these, as I said, innocuous items.
Is there accidental dosing that's occurring then? If it's, let's say it's a cigarette, for example, that's being laced, if I'm sharing with my friend and I pick up their cigarette, like,
There's no question about it, Andrew. A lot, and unfortunately, while this may be accidental, and I'm going to assume the very best in people's nature that it sometimes is accidental. Hey, you didn't know, but I had that cigarette. I got that from my friend, and it's laced with fentanyl. It's also sometimes used as a way to induct people into the world of opioid abuse, so that ultimately I can be their supplier in the future. It's clandestine. It's considered nefarious, so obviously, and it's heartbreaking and cruel, but it doesn't go unnoticed, believe me.
this is crazy. Tom, thank you so much for being on this episode. If someone wanted to reach out, how can they find you?
Anytime, and they can reach me on my website, tomviola.com, or anywhere on social media at Pharmacology Declassified. Thanks a lot, Andrew. Appreciate you, buddy.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to Fast Facts Ask the Expert. If you have a topic you'd like one of our experts to answer, simply email me, Andrew@ataleoftwohygienist.com, and we will get it on the air as soon as possible. Thanks for listening.